Hello! Welcome to my channel. We are starting a documentary series about the most impressive abandoned places in the world. It was great fun to make, but now almost no one can find them online. Let's go. It feels like we are at a turning point in history when civilization as we know it is being challenged by war, inflation, and climate change. We seem intent on repeating the mistakes of the past. But sometimes we can learn something from what happened before. What if we could go back in time and see the rise and fall of civilizations? Today we will discover the secrets of an abandoned city to help us understand how our world has changed so dramatically over the course of just the last century. For example, this ghost town was built as the center of a mining empire, but today there is not a single resident left. But why? What can its abandoned buildings tell us about how society has changed since then? And what can we learn from the mistakes of the past that could help us address the challenges we face today? The city is called Centralia, and it's located in the middle of a coal mining region in northeast Pennsylvania. The first European settlers arrived here in the 1700s, and the land remained in private hands. Until the early 20th century, when massive deposits of anthracite coal were discovered underneath the surface. The discovery led to the creation of the Centralia Coal Company, which employed thousands of miners to extract the valuable resource. In 1906, the company decided to build a town for its employees and their families. This was common practice among major companies in those days as a way of ensuring that their workers stayed productive and loyal. The idea was that if the company provided decent housing and amenities, its workers would be more likely to stay put rather than move elsewhere in search of better pay. Originally named Mammoth, the town boasted rows of identical two-story homes for its workers, as well as several schools, churches, and a large community building. The town even had its own rail line so that residents could easily commute to work. In fact, it was designed as a model town, offering its residents all the conveniences of urban life, while providing them with fresh air and space. However, after only 3 years of operation, the town's name was changed to Centralia. This was because the post office had already accepted a town with the name Mammoth, so they couldn't use it. It might seem trivial, but it was typical of the kind of problems that the town's leaders would have to deal with going forward. Despite these small setbacks, the town continued to grow. By 1929, it was home to nearly 3,000 people. That's about the same population as the nearby city of Scranton. But unlike Scranton, Centralia was entirely dependent on one industry. If the mine closed, the town would die. Of course, this wasn't the first time that this had happened. But by the 1920s, industrial towns were becoming increasingly common, and studying how they functioned gave us insight into the social and economic dynamics of the time. Unfortunately, the Great Depression hit Centralia hard. With the rest of the country, the mine closed and the town's economy collapsed. But eventually the mine reopened, and so did the town. However, the Second World War saw the town suffer once again as men left to fight overseas. This caused a labor shortage at the mine and forced the company to close again. By the end of the war, however, there was a new government policy that encouraged former soldiers to return to civilian life by buying houses. Centralia was desperate for residents, and the government was desperate to get soldiers settled. So the two sides came together, and the town began to thrive once again. For a brief time, that is, because by the 1970s, the mine was running out of coal. As production slowed, the town began to struggle yet again. Then in 1977, a seam of coal underneath the town spontaneously combusted. The fire spread quickly through the underground network of tunnels, and despite dozens of attempts, it could not be extinguished. As a result, the local government declared the town unfit for human habitation and offered its residents compensation to leave. Today, the town is still too dangerous for anyone to live there, but now you can explore it for yourself, if you dare. As you wander around the eerily quiet streets, you'll see that most of the town's buildings are still standing. Of course, they've suffered decades of neglect, and many of them have fallen into disrepair. However, they still give us some clues as to how the town used to function. For example, the school tells us about the importance placed on education by the town's founders. The church teaches us about the religious beliefs of the people who lived there. And the rows of identical houses show us how the company tried to create a sense of community among its workers. Perhaps most importantly, though, The town's buildings reveal something about the nature of the work that went on at the nearby mine. Since the mine was owned by a private company, the workers didn't just dig up the coal, they also had to process it before it could be sold. In fact, Centralia had its own power plant, which provided electricity to the town and fueled much of northeastern Pennsylvania. It also had its own railway, which transported the processed coal to market. And it had a large number of workshops where mechanics made sure that the equipment stayed in good working order. But what does this tell us about the world we live in today? Well, it reminds us that cities aren't just places where people live. They're also places where things happen. And understanding the history of a place can help us better understand the present. This is important because as we move forward, we need to be aware of the mistakes of the past. Otherwise, we risk repeating them. For example, Centralia was built as a company town, which meant that the workers were entirely dependent on the mine for their livelihood. This isn't unique to Centralia. Something that happened throughout history whenever a city's economy is based around a single industry. And it's something that we need to be aware of as we move forward. If we want to build sustainable cities in the future, we need to make sure that they're not dependent on a single industry or source of income. Another lesson we can learn from Centralia is about the importance of planning. When Centralia was built, the town's leaders thought they were creating a model community. They wanted to provide their workers with everything they needed to live happy and healthy lives. However, they failed to plan for the possibility that the mine would one day close. When that happened, the town was left without any economic activity, and it quickly fell into decline. Of course, no one could have predicted the mine fire, but it does remind us that we need to be prepared for the unexpected. We should never assume that things will always go according to plan. We should always have a backup plan in place just in case. Finally, the story of Centralia reminds us of the importance of preserving our history. When the town was abandoned, many people thought that it would simply disappear. After all, why would anyone want to live in a ghost town? However, over time, people have begun to appreciate the unique nature of a place like this. They've come from all over the world to explore the ruins and learn about the history of the town. In fact, there's now a small museum dedicated to Centralia. It's run by volunteers who are passionate about preserving the town's history and sharing it with others. So the next time you're feeling nostalgic for simpler times, take a trip to a nearby ghost town. You might be surprised at what you find.
Thanks for watching. Like, comments, and share.